I'd now like to introduce Lara Campbell, who is a professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Simon Fraser University, where she is also the chair of the department. She's the author of the prize-winning book, Respectable Citizens, Gender, Family, and Unemployment in the Great Depression from University of Toronto Press, and numerous publications on the welfare state, gender history, and the anti-war movement. She's completing a book to be called A Great Revolutionary Wave, The History of Women and the Vote in British Columbia, which will be published by the University of British Columbia Press. She's done a lot of research, I know, on the history of draft dodgers and draft resistors in British Columbia, Vancouver area. So it's a nice local, as there are a number of nice local components to the rethinking of the 60s in this conference. It's my pleasure to introduce Lara Campbell.
Thank you, Ian and Hoyen, for organizing this event, for visioning it and organizing it. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So I thought I would, people were sort of locating themselves a little bit yesterday. So as Ian mentioned, I started off working on the Great Depression. And I really kind of saw myself as a historian of gender and women in the family. So my coming to this project it's taken a few unexpected turns to get here. When I went to grad school in the 90s, for me anyway, the history of the 60s didn't seem to be on the radar, at least it wasn't for me. And I'm not a child of the 60s. I wasn't even born in the 60s. So I'm a child of the 80s. So my childhood fears and hopes and dreams were shaped by the fear of nuclear annihilation. So I have a kind of a different take maybe on the 60s. But I will say that as a young person, as a very young preteen and a teenager, I somehow got my hands on a whole Earth catalog and was strangely fascinated by this thing called the counterculture. Then I got interested in the music. Then I got interested in the politics of the 60s. So it was always an interest for me, but it wasn't something that I thought of as having an academic component until much later. So I was living in North Bay, Ontario, teaching on contract at Nipissing University. And there's not much to do in North Bay, so I'm out. We were out every night almost every night for drinks at the local pool hall. And so I was having some conversations with some new friends. And my two new friends started telling me their immigration story. It turned out they had come together to Canada in opposition to the Vietnam War. He had come as a draft dodger, draft resistor. She had come in opposition to the war and to support him. And they told me this incredible story about crossing the border and about what it was like to make a new life as Americans, from Boston, actually, who ended up in Canada. And even though I do women's history, I have to admit I'd never thought of women as war resistors before, so that was my blind spot. But of course, I thought this might make an interesting project, so I started to do a little poking around and soon discovered that historians had paid almost no attention to the tens of thousands of women who had come to Canada with draft dodgers. And I thought this would make a really simple, interesting, kind of short-term project. So it's 14 years later. That small topic has expanded. I think of it as kind of an octopus project with tentacles and sort of all sorts of themes. And it's a much larger project on the history of resistance to the Vietnam War more broadly in 1960s and 1970s Canada. So today I'm talking about the local and transnational politics of the anti-war movement, Vietnam anti-war activism. I will try to pay attention to Vancouver and British Columbia, but by its nature, this is a transnational movement. So I'll be talking about Canada and the United States more broadly as well. I've still got a lot of research to do here. And I'm going to try and be attentive to themes about the intersection of feminism in the anti-war movement, a little bit about what kind of Joan talked about. I think I'll end with something similar to what she was talking about yesterday. Gender and masculinity in particular, and a little bit on the politics of amnesty in the anti-war movement, which takes us into the mid-1970s as well. I've been away from this project for a couple of years working on other things, so I'm really interested in what you have to say and what directions you think I might be able to take this in the future. So let's just set up maybe some of the terms for what I'm talking about here today. Defining war resistance. Let's see if I can get the last bullet point isn't showing for some reason, but that's fine. So there's another bullet point here. It's not that important. Between 1966 and 76, about 250,000 draft-age Americans immigrated to Canada, double the number in the previous decade. And because the Canadian government didn't keep track of the reasons why people immigrated to Canada, really the numbers that are draft dodgers, this is a best guesstimate that historians and some sociologists have made. So the numbers range. Some people say 30,000 came in opposition to the war. Some people say 50 or even 100. Most people say around 50. It just depends who you read. But the majority of draft-age Americans who came in this period were women, many of whom came to support their husbands or their boyfriends who were dodging the draft, or in some cases on their own terms, in many cases on their own terms. So I've been exploring some of the documents in UBC special collections which show that women often acted preemptively in case their sons were drafted. And so what you see are a lot of women believing sort of post-1968, given the political chaos in the United States and numerous assassination attempts of political and assassinations, successful assassinations in the United States, that this war would go on forever. And they were worried that their 10, 11, and 12-year-old sons would eventually be drafted. So they're acting preemptively to seek out an alternative to living in the United States. Canadian Prime Ministers Lester Pearson and Pierre Trudeau refused military aid to the United States. They believed intervention in Vietnam was a mistake, but as I think we all know, they refused outright criticism and feared making any statement that would breach the US-Canada relationship, because we're talking about a period of Cold War integration. But the US was angered by Canada's willingness to allow draft dodgers into the country as quote-unquote regular immigrants, based on a position that a man's draft status was a matter between an individual and his country. So we're talking about three kind of types of war resistors and the organizations that were set up to support them. Men who were avoiding the draft. They were referred to at the time as draft dodgers and still refer to themselves as draft dodgers. I understand that's a pejorative term for some people, but it's still, as I've started talking to some men, some continue to wish to use that phrase, so I'm using it. But I understand the complexity of the terminology. Men who had deserted the military, and men and women who were not in danger of being drafted, but were angry at the state of American politics and wishing to leave the country. I see all of these people as occupying political space on a spectrum of war resistance. So I think of them all as war resistors. But they're different, right? It's not a homogeneous category. Some, though not the majority, were pacifists. Some on the anti-imperialist left were opposed to immigration, not opposed to immigration, intervention, wrong word, American intervention in Vietnam, but were not necessarily anti-war in principle, not necessarily anti-violence. They saw peace groups as hopelessly naive and were often willing to embrace some degree of political violence as a mechanism for change. So even though I'm thinking of war resistance quite inclusively, I don't think there's any getting around the fact that there are really substantial philosophical and ethical differences at play in differing positions on war. And part of what I'm trying to do over time is tease some of these differences out. Okay. Resistors to war, to the Vietnam War, arrived in a country that held an incredibly complex attitude to the Vietnam War, and it's an attitude that's kind of hard to pin down as a historian. On the one hand, increased media attention, and I put this picture up, very famous picture of the Associated Press in 1965, but again, we're all familiar, I think, with the media attention on the Vietnam War in this time. This media attention, especially to the suffering of Vietnamese civilians, helped spark a powerful anti-war movement across North America, bringing together students, faculty, liberals, Marxists, peace activists, and faith-based organizations, just to name a few. By the late 1960s, Vancouver had become the logical destination for American war resistors coming from the West Coast of the United States, and they arrived to a city with a thriving counterculture. But they also arrived to a city, and to many cities in Canada, where businesses refused service to dirty hippies, or where police raided hostels housing military deserters. Vancouver Mayor Tom Campbell, up here on the left, and Montreal Mayor Jean Drapeau both despised war resistors. Drapeau claimed they were part of a revolutionary conspiracy to overthrow the government. And Campbell claimed they were a scum community of lazy louts and lazy cowards. And I don't have time to play you the clip, but you can go online, Google Tom Campbell's rant against war resistors, and it goes on for quite a long time. Both Campbell and Drapeau said that they would be willing to use the War Measures Act to remove draft dodgers from their cities. Canadian public opinion, I'm not going to talk about these numbers, they're Gallup poll numbers, but I thought I'd throw them up just to show you some of the complexity of Canadian public opinion. Over time, what you see when you look at Gallup polls, it's hard to trace because the questions are always different, so it's tricky to sort of make a general analysis here. But what you can see over time is decreased support for American actions in Vietnam. So definitely there's a decrease in support by Canadians. But this is always accompanied by concern about draft dodgers themselves. You know, only 32% claim that they sympathize with draft dodgers in 1968, and only 28% of Canadians believe they should be accepted as immigrants. So I was a little surprised when I saw some of these numbers. It's hard to know why people are answering the questions in this way, but I think what we can take away from some of these statistics is a larger theme of ambivalence, and that's a theme that I'd maybe like to come back to a few times today. By the mid-1960s, Canadians couldn't look away from either what the Americans were doing in the war or what Canada was doing in the war, Canada's relationship to the war, which I will talk about in a minute. But discomfort with the war was always influenced by Canada's close economic and political integration with the United States, especially in the Cold War, by Canada's long tradition of equating masculinity with war service, and tensions about the influence of American immigration. Alan Seeger mentioned this yesterday, talking about Robin Matthews, who he saw draft dodgers as the agents of American imperialism in Canada. So there are a lot of reasons why people might not support draft dodgers, and they're not always right-wing ones. It's a complicated series of beliefs. Certainly many American and Canadian conservatives supported the war. Tom Campbell was one. He actually sent a flag to fly on a Navy ship in the Gulf of Tonkin. Some supported the war, and some believed that dodgers were cowards, men who were not doing their masculine duty to defend the nation. So equating masculinity with the courage to fight and feminizing resistance to military service has a long historical tradition in this country. Draft dodgers were accused of being spineless and gutless cowards. Dodging the draft was commonly referred to as running away, fleeing, skipping out, or evading. Okay. So if a man who fled the United States wasn't a real man, then what was he? The draft resistance group that put out Amex, Americans in Exile, which was centered in Toronto, collected the hate mail sent to them over the years, and it's now in the Wisconsin Historical Society archives in Madison. Deep anger can be seen in the photos of these documents that were sent to Dodgers living in exile. These are just a few, but there's quite a lot of them. Many war supporters saw resistors as cowards who lacked moral integrity and maturity. So a resistor was not a real man, but kind of like a selfish child who runs away from adult responsibility, or like a woman, weak, long-haired, and fearful. Those are the kinds of analogies that you see. I'm not sure how well you can see this image. This accompanied a letter to draft dodgers who were living in Canada, which I think is a clear correlation between this sense that refusing to fight is a kind of feminine dependency, right? So you see the draft dodger who's sitting in his mother's lap. You could make the argument this is also homophobic, that it's transphobic, and it's drawing on these images of lack of masculinity and the mother being portrayed as kind of deeply unfeminine and both of them are quite selfish. A man who refused military service was understood to be so apathetic and cowardly that he would run out of his country, but also turn his back on a new one. Prime Minister John Diefenbaker held this view, claiming that because draft dodgers had refused to defend their own country, they could not be relied on to protect ours. And that's something that Tom Campbell says in his rant, which is an interview that he gives to the CBC. If they can't defend their own country when their country calls on them to do it, they're the worst kind of immigrant that we could possibly accept here in Canada. I think it would be a mistake, however, to assume that the language of evasion and unmanliness was restricted solely to supporters of the war. Anti-war liberals and the anti-war left were also concerned about draft dodgers as well, often seeing them as, quote, copping out of political activism, a very common phrase in the late 60s. So for liberals, draft dodgers were evading their duty, not to defend the nation, but their duty to mount pressure from within the United States and from within the already existing political system to bring the war to an end. In 1968, Harvard University students and future semi-famous Canadian historians, depends who you are, I guess, in the crowd, Michael Bliss and Robert Bothwell, debated whether draft dodging was an ethical response to the horrors of war in the Globe and Mail. This is what they said. The draft dodgers' decision to leave the United States for Canada is exactly analogous to the decision to escape from a city to the suburbs. For them, leaving was a disavowal of what they called the demands of citizenship. If everyone who opposed the war left the country, then they believed the United States would be lost to what they called militarists and racists. And not only that, Canada would be consumed, their language, in a flood of American immigration. Many radical anti-war activists shared this belief that draft dodging was a cop-out of the political process, arguing, though, that the only way to end the war was to shut down the military system from within the United States by direct action, by confrontation with the police, and by imprisonment, if necessary. Folk singer Joan Baez was quite strident on this particular point. She performed a number of times in Canada in the late 1960s, and because her husband, David Harris, had been imprisoned in the United States, she was often asked by reporters what she thought about draft dodgers, and sometimes she even got into kind of semi-shouting matches with the crowds of people at her concerts, the crowds which actually included many draft dodgers themselves. So she gave an interview, and she was asked by a reporter what she thought about draft dodgers in Canada, and she said, not much, really. I think they should stay here, by which she meant the United States, even though she was in Canada when she gave this interview. Stay here and go to jail. I mean, instead of running away. Anything other than going to jail is being a cop-out. Being willing to face imprisonment was a badge of courage and honor, a way to use your body to challenge the draft. And I'm sort of collecting these kinds of critiques of draft dodgers, and I'm thinking that partly the reason the critique is so harsh against draft dodgers in the 60s is because the charge of copping out resonates very well across multiple political ideologies, from conservative to radical. All of these ideologies evoked an image of a weak man shirking his responsibilities to either fight for the nation, to be a good citizen and make the US better, or to overthrow American imperialism. The ideal man, whether he's conservative, liberal, or radical, was dedicated to a larger cause and willing to risk fear, imprisonment, or even death. So I think there's something that connects this critique